Chapter 22. A mile head start. It would appear an insurmountable advantage. Even with a much superior horse chasing, how many miles must be traversed before that gap could be closed? Could the lost ground be recovered in 8 miles? It seemed highly improbable, even to Milligan, who was optimistic about his mare and aware of her exceptional swiftness. However, that turned out to be the reality. 8 miles brought him so near to the pursuer that the runaway had no choice but to press on. He felt no surprise that they were traveling along the river path. He even thought he knew how he could intercept his target by taking a shortcut. But this would not achieve his goal. He wanted to catch him in the act, and leaving him now would give him an opportunity that he was confident would be taken advantage of immediately. The river path led to the ranch, and the only paths anywhere along its route were those running north and south of the crossing. Steadily he closed the gap, step by step, yard by yard. Sometimes he saw his prey. Sometimes he was only guided by the sound of the galloping hooves. Now that he was urging her, the Lady Jezebel had released the reins, not only willing but eager to perform better than her best. No rider could resist such a plea. And as they rode, Milligan found himself speaking to her with an affection that would have seemed ridiculous to anyone but a horseman. It made him smile to see her ears pinned back, not in the manner of a horse giving its final efforts, but with that aggressive demeanor she always had, as if she were charging open-mouthed at Jacob Smith, as he had witnessed her do in the enclosure when he first met her. When they reached the river crossing, he was only a mere 100 yards behind his target. Here the path veered off towards the ranch, and the trees met overhead, casting darkness from the moon. It was completely dark, and he could only rely on the sound of the other horse ahead. Alongside the crossing, he became aware that this sound had abruptly ceased, and at the bend in the path, he halted and listened intently. They stood there, the mare's powerful body heaving beneath him, until her rider caught the faint sound of rustling foliage somewhere directly ahead of them. Instantly, a memory came to his aid, and he chuckled as he veered the horse off the path and dashed into the thick vegetation. This was the exact location where he had reluctantly taken refuge in the wilderness before. There was no hesitation or doubt. They sped through the entanglement and found their way onto the unused trail they had both traversed previously. The fugitive had now gained a significant lead, and for the first time since the race had commenced, Milligan urged his mare to go faster. However, she simply shook her head, snorted, and flicked her tail, as if to protest that the demand was unnecessary. She couldn't perform the impossible, which he was asking of her. Nevertheless, his insistent request stemmed from his realization that they had entered the final stretch of the race, and the finish line was not far away. It had to happen now or never. He quickly grasped that the remaining distance was far too short. As he arrived at the point where the forest abruptly ended, he noticed that daybreak had occurred. The dim light revealed that he was still approximately 30 yards behind. They had reached the familiar rugged terrain. Ahead of him lay the plateau that led to the merging of the river and the cliff. It was this sight that sparked an idea within him. He recalled the diverging path towards the bridge, as well as its wider curve compared to the path he had initially taken. Leaping over the river would gain him 50 yards. However, in that lighting, it was an extremely risky endeavor. He hesitated. Irritated by his own indecisiveness, he resolved to take a chance and risk everything on one attempt. The other horse was clearly falling behind. He leaned down and affectionately patted his mare's neck. That simple gesture restored his confidence. He believed she was still performing at her best. The river held no fears for her. He witnessed the masked man veer towards the bridge, but he continued straight ahead. He anxiously glanced at the sky once more. The dreary gray remained untouched by the faintest hint of sunrise, although it was growing brighter. The cloud cover was dispersing, yet still managing to delay the arrival of daylight. He had no choice but to steady himself in the saddle for the impending challenge. Regardless of the illumination, he could not turn back now, and in that moment, he forgot about the fugitive. His focus shifted towards the river up ahead, and the crucial instant when he must guide the mare, without which he could not hope to reach the distant bank after her arduous journey. His resolve was unwavering and his eyes more alert than ever. Everything around him became sufficiently clear. The swiftly passing bushes were now distinctly outlined, and he believed he could already discern the demarcation of the river's edge. They raced forward, he leaning forward and the mare's ears perked, attuned to the murmurs of the approaching water. Unconsciously, he gripped the saddle's stirrups with all his might, and his body crouched as if preparing to leap himself. And then the moment arrived. He spurred and lifted, and the spirited beast surged forward like a rocket. In an instant, they landed. However, the dim lighting must have deceived her. She had leaped farther than before, and upon colliding with a boulder using her front hooves, she executed a complete somersault, tumbling headfirst to the ground, catapulting her rider several yards out of the saddle and onto the soft, loose sand of the trail ahead. Completely unharmed, Milligan promptly rose to his feet, but the mare remained motionless where she had fallen. A sense of profound remorse overwhelmed the man as he turned and gazed upon her. He witnessed the masked rider charging towards the hillside on his tired horse, just 20 yards away, but he paid no attention. A glance into the mare's dull eyes was enough to inform him of what he had done. He had killed her. The first truly honest action of her life had led to the unfortunate creature's demise. Her slender neck was broken, along with both of her front legs. Once he had confirmed the truth, he abandoned her, and casting his gaze upon the hill, realized that it was high time. The rider had disappeared, but his exhausted horse remained halfway up the slope, stuck in the loose sand. It was either too frightened or too worn out to move, standing there in despair, knee-deep in mud. The task of ascending to the ledge was no easy feat, but Milligan approached it without hesitation. The other man had only a little less than a minute's head start, and since there was only one other way out of the place, and an unpromising one at that, he had little concern about the man's eventual escape. No, there was no way for him to escape, and furthermore, a smile illuminated his determined face as he realized that daylight had finally arrived. The clouds had finally yielded to the pink messenger of sunrise. He completed the final part of the climb, breathing heavily, and stepped onto the gravel-covered plateau, gun in hand. He was grateful for his 5-chambered companion. Those tough acquaintances of his on the ranch were correct. There was nothing as persuasive, decisive, or reassuring to the wielder, and confounding to their adversaries as a well-handled firearm. The ledge was empty. He surveyed the towering cliff, but there was no sign of his man in that direction. He proceeded towards the cabin, but as soon as he took the first step, the door of the underground shelter swung open, and William Selby, armed with a gun, burst out. He arrived swiftly without hesitation, with confidence, but as the door swung open and the flood of daylight illuminated him, he recoiled with a sorrowful cry of despair, and Milligan realized that he had not anticipated the transition from dimness to daylight. He required no further evidence of his suspicions. The rancher was only visually impaired in the presence of intense light. For a mere moment, he stood cowering. Then, feeling his way, he swiftly darted around the side of the structure and scrambled towards the precarious staircase in the rock. Milligan immediately confronted him, but he paid no attention. He had reached the bottom of the stairs and was ascending for his life and freedom. The other man understood that he should have opened fire on him, but his long-standing desire to rely on his own hands and physical strength overcame his better judgment, and he charged at him. His instinct was compassionate but futile, as the man was climbing with astonishing speed, and by the time he had reached the base of the ladder, he was out of reach. There was no option now but to use his firearm or pursue. However, one glance at the treacherous ascent left him with no choice. "Continue, and I will shoot you, William Selby," he shouted. "I have 5 rounds loaded in each gun." In response, the visually impaired man intensified his efforts. Onward he went, upward, until it made the man below dizzy to witness his progress. Milligan raised his firearm and fired wide, allowing the bullet to strike the rock near the man's right hand to demonstrate his intentions. He observed the limestone splinter as the bullet connected, while the groping hand reached higher for a fresh grip. However, it had no other impact. He was perplexed. If the man reached the top, he knew that somewhere beyond the edge lay a route to safety, and he was getting closer to it. inching his way towards it with his crawling, clinging grip on the face of the rock. He shuddered as he watched, completely captivated even against his own will. Deprived of vision, the man's entire body seemed alert with an instinct that served him instead. His movements resembled those of a squid, blindly extending its long tentacles and pulling itself up with the power of its suction cups. He shouted a final warning. "This is your last opportunity," he cried. And now his aim was accurate, and his determination unwavering. The only response was a hurried movement from the climber. Milligan's finger was on the trigger, while his eyes were fixed on his target. But the hammer didn't fall. The final squeeze of his hand was halted, while horror surged into his sharply focused eyes. Something had occurred up there on the cliff. The man had slipped. One foot shot out helplessly as the frantic climber fought for those last few steps before the shot was fired. He desperately tried to regain his balance, but the sudden jolt carried the weight of his body with it and forcefully ripped his other foot from its grip. For a fraction of a second, the man below became aware of the gripping hands, desperately clinging to the rock, and then he dropped his gun and covered his ears as a piercing scream rang out. He couldn't witness any more. He only heard, despite his blocked ears, the thud of a soft body falling. He saw, even though his eyes closed almost immediately, a huddled figure landing heavily on the edge of the plateau and disappearing below. It all happened in an instant. Then silence prevailed, and when he opened his eyes, there was no gruesome sight. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed. It had vanished. No evidence remained. Not a shred of fabric, not a drop of blood. Nothing. He knew. His imaginary vision of the old trapper had been acted out before his very eyes. All that remained of William Selby was lying down there. ****, Files and Milligan were standing in the valley below. They were gazing at the mangled remains of the rancher. Files had removed the piece of red blanket from the dead man's face and held it up for inspection. He grunted. "The game's over." "There's more of that up there in the cabin," said Milligan. "Mixed breed blanket," commented Files, folding it up and carefully putting it in his pocket. Then he turned and gazed down the gaping valley. It was an amazing place, a massive rift extending for miles into the heart of the mountains. "A nice game, too," he continued. "Ever seen this place before?" "Once," Milligan replied. Then he told the officer of his runaway ride. Files listened with interest. At the end he said, "Too bad you didn't tell me about this earlier. However, you missed the main attraction. Look down there in the shelter of the cliff. See about a mile down. Enough corrals to herd 10,000 cattle. And they are cleverly arranged." Milligan now became aware of a scattered array of corrals stretching out into the distance, but so arranged at the base of the towering walls of the valley that they needed to be carefully searched for. Then he looked up at the ledge which had been the scene of the disaster and the ladder of cut steps above, and he pointed at them. "I wonder what's on the other side." "That's an easy one," replied his companion promptly. "Mixed-race individuals." "A settlement?" "That's about it. You remember the mixed-race people cleared out from their old settlement recently? We've never found them. Once they take to the hills, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. Maybe friend Anton is hiding there. I doubt it. Tough McCulloch didn't belong to them, as I told you. He comes from across the border. No, he's getting away as fast as his horse can carry him. And Arizona isn't far off his trail, if I'm any judge." Files's great round face was turned contemplatively on his companion. "Well, that's for the future, anyway," he observed, and moved to a bush some yards away. "Let's take it easy. Money, one of my deputies, has gone in for a wagon. I don't expect him for a couple of hours or so. We must keep it company," he added, nodding his head in the direction of the dead man. They sat down and silently lit their pipes. Files was the first to speak. "Guess I've got to thank you," he said, as though that sort of thing was quite out of his province. Milligan shook his head. "Not me," he said. "Thank my poor mare." Then he added with a bitter laugh, "Why, but for the accident of his fall, I'm not sure he wouldn't have escaped. I'm pretty weak-kneed when it comes to dropping a man in cold blood." The other shook his head. "No, he wouldn't have escaped. You underestimate yourself. But even if you had missed, I had him covered with my carbine. I was watching the whole thing down here. You see, Money and I came on behind. I don't suppose we were more than a few minutes after you. That mare you were riding was a dandy. I see she's done." "Yes," Milligan said sorrowfully, "and I'm not ashamed to say it's hit me hard. She did us a good turn, and she owed it to us." "You mean when she upset everything during the fight?" "Yes. Well, she's more than made amends. In spite of her temper, that mare of mine was the finest thing on the ranch." "Yours?" Files raised his eyebrows. "Well, Selby's." But the officer shook his head. "Not Selby's. She belonged to me. 3 years ago I turned her out to graze at Whitewater with a bunch of others, as an incorrigible rogue and vagabond. The entire lot was stolen, and one of the security guards was shot. Her name was Strike'em." "Strike'em?" "Yes. Have you ever had her charge at you with both front feet and her mouth open?" Milligan nodded. "That's her. Strike'em. A great mare, half-blooded. But Selby told Lonnie he bought her from a mixed race group." "I suppose he did." Files relit his pipe for about the 20th time, which prompted Milligan to hand him his tobacco pouch. "Try some tobacco," he said with a smile. The sheriff accepted the offer calmly. The subtle sarcasm went unnoticed. Perhaps the man was too focused on the current situation, because he continued as if no interruption had occurred. "After seeing you on that mare, I found the ranch intriguing, but the man's blindness deceived me all along. I had no trouble figuring out that Lonnie had nothing to do with it. I was also assured that none of the workers were involved. Anton was my suspect. But soon I discovered he wasn't the actual leader. So far, so good. Only Selby remained, but he was blind. Last night when you came for me and told me what had happened at the ranch and about the lit lamp, it all clicked. But even then, I still didn't fully understand. The man was blind in daylight but could see in darkness or dim light. Now what kind of strange blindness is that? And he managed to keep it a secret, pretending to be blind all the time. It was clever, devilishly clever." Milligan nodded. "Yes, he fooled all of us, even his daughter." The other man shot a quick glance from the corners of his eyes. "I suppose so," he remarked, and waited. They smoked in silence. "What's your next move?" asked Milligan, as the other man showed no inclination to speak. The man shrugged. "Take control of the ranch. Just keep the workers to run it. The lady should definitely head to Falls if she has any friends there. You should make sure of it. I hear that you like to gossip, you know." "Yes. There will be inquiries and formalities. I don't know about the property. The government will take care of that." Milligan pondered for a moment. Suddenly, he turned to his companion. "Sheriff," he said earnestly, "I hope you'll do your best to spare Miss Selby. She has had an incredibly miserable life with him. I can assure you that she had no knowledge of this strange blindness. I would swear to it with my last breath." "I don't doubt you, my boy," the other said warmly. "We owe you too much to doubt you. We'll try to minimize any inconvenience for her. However, she did have some awareness of that blindness, or else she wouldn't have acted the way she did with that lamp. To be honest, she will have to give a statement. Have no doubt she will explain. Absolutely. I think I hear the wheels of the car." Files looked around. Then he settled back down. "Lonnie," he continued, "was the smartest among us. I can't believe he was ever informed about his boss's peculiar blindness. He must have discovered it. He was playing a high-stakes game, and all for a woman. Well, well. No doubt he thought she was worth it," said Milligan with some irritation. The officer smiled at the tone. "No doubt, no doubt. Still, he wasn't young. He deceived you when he agreed with your suspicions of Anton. That is, he knew you were on the wrong track and wanted to keep you there. I can also understand why you were sent to Willow Bluff. You knew too much. You were too nosy. Moreover, based on what you revealed to Lonnie, which he passed on to the blind man for his own benefit, you wanted too much. You had to be eliminated, just like others in the past. Yes, it was all very clever. And he never spared his own livestock. Cheated himself by transferring a group of cattle to these pens, and later on, I suppose, letting them wander back to his own pastures. I only wonder why, with a ranch like his, he took the risk. Perhaps it was old-time associations. He was once involved in the slave trade, and no doubt he stocked his ranch originally by stealing the Indians' cattle. Then, When white people came around and the Indians disappeared, he continued his thefts on a smaller scale. Ah, involved in the slave trade, was he? Who said? Miss Selby innocently told me he once traded in the Caribbean in black ivory. She did not understand. Just so, here's the wagon. Files rose leisurely to his feet, and Money drove up. The best of news, Sheriff, the latter cried at once. Captured the whole group. Some of the boys are badly hurt, but we've got them all. Well, we'll return with this, the officer replied calmly. The deceased man was lifted into the wagon, and in a few minutes the small group was on its way back to the ranch. Chapter 23. Files took charge of the ranch operations. He had temporary control and proved to be an excellent manager. Milligan couldn't help but think how much more suited Files seemed to be in the pastoral setting compared to his usual work environment. However, this appointment only lasted a week. The authorities assigned another person to take over so that Files could focus on the urgent task of investigating the death of the rancher and his foreman, as well as the trial of the mixed-race raiders captured at Widow Dangley's place. Following Milligan's advice, Heather decided to stay with Mrs. Dock, ostler in Falls. This kind and chatty elderly lady treated Heather as a grieving and sick child, providing comfort, care, and occasionally administering tonics. In actuality, Heather, although greatly shocked by her father's death and the revelation of his heinous criminality, did not feel the sorrow typically associated with the loss of a parent. She was genuinely relieved to escape from her previous residence, which had brought her so much unhappiness and misery. Later, when Milligan informed her that it was essential for him to accompany Files to Whitewater as a witness, she was even more grateful for her departure. Thanks to Files's influence and consideration, she was spared the ordeal of the trial in Whitewater. She had already provided her sworn testimony during the preliminary inquiry on the ranch, which was subsequently presented as evidence in the higher court. As a result, it took nearly a month for Milligan to finally return to Falls. Throughout that time, he was extremely occupied with ranch matters and his own affairs, leaving him with little time to communicate with the waiting girl, except for brief and infrequent notes of loving support. Surprisingly, these messages had an unexpected effect. The sadness that had become almost second nature to Heather continued to deepen, and Mrs. Ostler, who was always kind and attentive to her, noticed her increasing despondency. With maternal concern, despite having no children of her own, Mrs. Ostler insisted on the only remedy she knew: medicine. Understanding that there was no medicine to cure her condition, Heather reluctantly accepted the kind treatment. She knew that, despite Milligan's tender messages and assurances of affection, he could never play a greater role in her life than he currently did. Even in death, her father had fulfilled his threat. She could never enter into marriage, as it would be a cruel injustice to any man. She told herself that no respectable man would ever marry a woman with such a past, such ancestry, and so she waited for her lover's return to inform him. Once she considered writing it, but she knew Jack too well. He would only come down to Falls as quickly as possible, and that might disrupt his plans, and she had no desire to cause him further trouble. She would tell him her decision when he had the time to come to her. Then she would wait for the government orders about the ranch, and if she were allowed to keep it, she would sell the land as soon as possible and leave the country forever. She felt that this course of action was the right one to take, but it was very, very difficult, and no amount of tonics could dispel the deepening shadows that the cruelty of her situation had brought upon her young face. It was remarkable the kindness and sympathy extended to her in that rough settlement. There was not a person, especially the men, who did not do everything in their power to help her forget her troubles. No one ever mentioned Flybend in her presence, and instead adopted a rough, cheerful humor, which seemed very forced for the majority, because most of them were uneducated, hard-living people who were desperately serious in the struggle for survival. And back to this place Milligan came one day. He was a very different man now from what he had been on his first visit. He looked around as he crossed the market square, quickly finding Doc. Ostler's little house. He smiled to himself as he thought of the woman waiting for him there. But he stayed on his path and rode directly to Ayala's bar. Here, as before, he got off his horse, but he needed no assistance or guidance. He immediately hung his horse's reins over the hitching post and walked into the bar. The first man to greet him was his old friend Whist Ranks. The little man looked up at him in a calculating way, narrowing his eyes at him in a way he remembered so well. There was no change in the scoundrel's appearance. In fact, he was wearing the same clothes Milligan had first seen him in. They were neither cleaner nor dirtier. The man seemed to have completely stagnated since their initial encounter, just like everything else in the bar seemed to have stagnated. There were the same men there, maybe one or two more, along with the same foul atmosphere and the same dingy hue throughout the entire interior. Nothing appeared to have changed. Whist's greeting was typical. "Well, blind fools have passed, huh? I figured you were coming out on top. I guess the government will treat you generously." The butcher laughed loudly from his spot at the counter. Milligan noticed that he was still standing with his back to it, his hands still tightly gripping the molded edge, as if he had never changed his position since the first time Milligan saw him. Chuck, the carpenter, glanced up from the small table where he was playing solitaire with a greasy deck of cards. His face still showed the puzzled expression he had been wearing while contemplating the array of spots and pictures just a moment ago. The others who were unfamiliar to him turned to him curiously upon hearing Whist's greeting, and Ayala paused in the act of wiping a glass, a task he never failed to do, no matter how slow business was. Milligan felt that he owed something to those who showed such interest in his return, so he walked to the counter and ordered drinks. Then he turned to Whist. "Well," he said, "I'm going to stay here for a week or two." "I'm really happy," said Ranks, his eyes lighting up at the prospect. He remembered how profitable this man had been before. "The missus will be happy too," he added. "She's a visionary woman, no doubt about it. We have a special room for esteemed guests like yourself. It's got a brand-new iron bed with stylish green and red stripes and a matching wash basin. Let me tell you, it's a fantastic setup, and it's only $3 a week without meals. I'll go right over and let her know, okay?" Milligan objected and placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Don't bother. Ayala here is going to take care of me, right, Ayala?" "That's right," replied the barkeeper, grinning triumphantly at the convincing Whist. "Well now, you really surprise me. To think that you're turning your back on a friend like that," Whist protested, while the butcher laughed and extended his arms further along the bar. "I guess he's had a few," the carpenter observed, shuffling his cards again. "I reckon that bed is infested with bugs, and the wash basin is mostly used for dumping leftovers," he finished scornfully. Ranks looked at the gloomy man with an unfriendly glare. "I guess I never knew you without you being insulting, Chuck," he remarked in a tone of pity. "Some people are just like that. I guess you're too focused on those cards. You've never been the brightest bulb." "Say, Ayala," he turned back to the bar complainingly, "where are those darn brandy cocktails Mr. Milligan ordered a while ago? You're moving as slow as a funeral procession on an uphill trail. Slow, huh? I say, if we're going to be poisoned, let's get it over with." "Coming right up, Whist," Ayala replied, winking to let Milligan know that the man's impatience was just a cover for his frustration with Chuck. "I've been trying to poison you for 10 years. I guess Chuck still wants to nail a few planks around you. Here you go. More on the way." "Who needs me?" Chuck asked, looking up from his cards. "Whist Ranks?" he questioned, pausing. "I've got a couple of planks that would suit him. Red pine, burns better." He lit his pipe with a showy gesture and took a loud puff from it. Whist put down his cocktail and gave him a disgusted look. "Hey, be careful with that lighter. Don't blow on it, or you won't need any firewood for you." "Gentlemen, gentlemen," shouted Ayala jokingly, "let's focus on the present. Just because Whist here runs a boarding house, there's no need to discuss his future so crudely." "Don't be so critical, Ayala," said Whist a little angrily. "I guess my boarding establishment is bothering you. You're feeling a hurricane. That's what you're feeling, I guess. It makes you sick to see people getting value for their money, doesn't it?" Good for you, cried the butcher, and laughed loudly. The unusual outburst from this man surprised everyone. The whole group stopped to stare at his shining, grinning face. "Go for it, Whist," said a thin man Milligan had heard called Sawney Martin. "I always say you have a great aim every time, but be careful, or the boss will ban you from the game." "I don't owe him anything," growled Whist. which is unusual in this group, observed the smiling Ayala. He loved to annoy Whist. "Hey, Chuck," he continued, "how does Whist treat you in his hotel? You don't seem to be well fed." "Could be worse," responded the carpenter sadly. "But you see, I have a good relationship with Dr. Osler, and he regularly treats me." Everybody laughed along with the butcher this time. "Hey, you darn funeral director, you're getting a bit fresh, but I bet $1 that you won't leave and come wandering around Ayala's land as long as my wife does the cooking." "I believe your wife can cook," said Chuck enthusiastically. "Anyone who says she can't is lying. But with her, my respect for your pigsty ends. I think this argument is over for now. Who wants to play cards?" Whist turned back to the bar. "Hey, Ayala," he said, handing over a $10 bill. "Exchange this for chips. We're wasting precious time chatting. I'm going for a round of poker. And hey, can you give me a new deck of cards? Looks like Chuck needs to shuffle his luck." "Mr. Milligan," he continued, turning to his former tenant, "maybe I owe you some. What do you think?" "No thanks, Whist," replied Milligan confidently. "I'm becoming quite skilled." "Ah." The small man moved away with a pensive smile on his weathered wooden features. Milligan observed as these men took their places for the game. Their recent quarrel was completely forgotten in their fervor for poker. And what a game it was. Each man, uneducated and unsophisticated in all other aspects, was a master at poker, an artist. The base instincts of the game appealed to the highest aspects of their personalities. They were there to outsmart each other through any means necessary. Each man understood that his opponent was doing everything he knew, and he didn't mind. He would only mind if the cheater was caught. Then there would be serious trouble, but they were all experienced wrongdoers. They had been engaging in that kind of behavior for years, and they would continue to do so for years to come. It was their way of life, and Milligan had no opinion on whether it was right or wrong. He had no right to judge them, and besides, he sympathized with them as individuals struggling in the great battle of life. But soon he left the table, as Files had arrived, and he had been waiting for him. However, the sheriff came alone, and Milligan asked him why. "Well, you see, Nelson is outside, Milligan," the burly man said with something resembling a smile. "He wouldn't come in. Shall we go out to him?" The other agreed, and they exited. Joe was sitting on his tan pony, gazing at the bar with a deep yearning in his aged eyes. "Why are you sitting there?" Milligan immediately inquired. Then he regretted asking. "Hey," Joe said casually with no hesitation, "I think you should already know by now. There are creatures that survive on liquid, and most of them have tails. Maybe I haven't developed that yet. Maybe I'll go see Doc, Osler, and get it sorted out. And then I'll be back on track," he added, as an afterthought. Joe smiled as much as his twisted face would allow, but Milligan was annoyed with himself for eliciting such a confession from him. "Well, I apologize for suggesting it, Joe," he quickly responded. "As you said, I should have known better. Never mind that. I want you to do me a favor. Tell me what it is, and I'll do it no matter what." The little man brightened at the thought of this man asking for his help. Milligan didn't respond right away. He didn't want to be too direct about the matter. He didn't want Joe to feel like he was being treated as inferior. "Well, you see, I'm in need of someone experienced to give me some friendly assistance. You see, I've purchased a lovely property and, well, I'm starting my own ranch, and I want you to come and help me with it, that's all." Joe looked out over the market, then his gaze drifted towards the distant hills. His eyes landed on Doc, Osler's house. He cleared his throat and contorted his face into a peculiar shape. His eyes glanced at the saloon's door before returning to Milligan. He swallowed a few times, then suddenly extended his hand as if he were about to strike his benefactor. "Shake on it," he muttered hoarsely, and Milligan firmly grasped the offered hand. "And maybe you'll have that flower garden, Joe," he said, "without any weeds." "Mr. Milligan, sir? Let's shake again." "Don't worry about the Mr. or the Sir," Milligan replied. "We're old friends. Now, Files," he continued, turning to the officer, who had been observing with interest. "Do you have any news for Miss Selby?" "Yes, the decision has been made. I have the document here in my pocket." "Good. But don't tell me. Give me a head start of 1 hour. I'm going to see the lady myself. And Joe? Milligan looked up at the old man's joyful face. Will you come with the sheriff when he interviews our client? All right, Miss... No. Milligan No. All right, Milligan, said the old man in an oddly hoarse voice. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk Heather was facing her lover for their final meeting. Mrs. Osler had discreetly left them, and now they were sitting in the small living room, the man, at the girl's request, sitting as far from her as the room's size would allow. All his cheerfulness had abandoned him, and a clear frown marred the openness of his face. Heather herself appeared a bit older than when we last saw her at the ranch. The dark circles around her beautiful eyes were darker, and her face looked thinner and paler, while her eyes shone with a feverish intensity. You overruled my decision once, Jack, she said in a low tone that she struggled to keep steady, but this time it must not be. Well, listen here, Danny. I can give you just 1 hour to ease your mind, but I honestly tell you, after that you'll have to say yes, despite all your objections. So go ahead, here's the watch. I'm going to time you. Milligan spoke lightly and concluded with a laugh, but he didn't feel like laughing. This objection caught him off guard. He had imagined a completely different encounter. Heather shook her head. I can say everything I need to say in less time than that, Jack. Promise me that you won't misunderstand me. You know my heart, dear. It's all yours. But, Jack, I didn't reveal everything I knew at the investigation. She paused, but Milligan made no offer to assist her. I knew Father could see at night. He had what Mr. Osler calls a nyctalops. That's it. It's some strange disease and not actual blindness at all, as far as I can understand. He simply couldn't see in daylight because there was something about his eyes that allowed in so much light that all sense of vision was paralyzed, and during those times he experienced intense pain. But when evening came, in the moonlight or late twilight, in fact, at any time when there was no strong light, just a soft radiance, he could not only see, but had particularly sharp vision. How he kept his secret for so many years, I don't know. I understand why he did, but even now, I can't comprehend what drove him to commit the terrible acts he did, despite being wealthy and all. Milligan thought he could make a pretty accurate guess, but he waited for her to continue. Jack, I discovered that he could see at night when you were unwell, just before you regained consciousness, she continued, in a solemn, awestruck tone. Yes. While you were lying there unconscious, you narrowly avoided being killed. Again she paused and visibly shuddered. I was afraid of something. His behavior when you were brought in cautioned me. He seemed to resent your existence. He certainly resented you being in the house, but above all, my care for you. I was very watchful, but the pressure was too much, and one night, feeling that the risk of falling asleep was very real, I blocked off the stairs. I did my best to stay awake, but foolishly sat down on my own bed and dozed off. Then I woke up suddenly. I can't say what woke me. Anyway, realizing I had slept, I became alarmed for you. I grabbed the flashlight and ventured into the hallway, where I discovered my barricade had been removed. Yes, and your father was standing by my bedside, his hands wrapped around my throat, I explained. Loosening the bandage, he responded. To, I asked. To reopen the wound and let you bleed to death, he confessed. I see. Yes, I remember. I dreamt the entire scene, except for the bandage part. But you... I trailed off. I had the lit lamp, and as soon as its light shone on him, he was as blind as a bat. His hands clumsily fumbled around your bandage, unsure of what to do. Yes, he was certainly blind then. I believe he would have attacked me if not for my threat to use the lamp and call for help, I recounted. Brave little woman, yes, I remember your words. They were in my dream, and that's how you knew what to do later on when Lonnie and he... The girl nodded. So Files was correct, Milligan pondered. You did know. Was I wrong, Jack, for not revealing it at the inquest? You see, he is dead, and... I began. On the contrary, you were right. It wouldn't have made any difference. However, you could have told me, he replied. Well, I didn't know what to do, the girl admitted, feeling a bit helpless. You see, I never considered cattle theft. It never crossed my mind that he was, or could be, Red Mask. I only saw it as a wicked attempt on your life, which was unlikely to happen again, and there was no purpose in informing you. Besides, The horror. Yes, I understand. Perhaps you were right. However, it could have set us on the right path, just as the confrontation with Lonnie and your subsequent actions did. But it doesn't matter. It's all in the past. William Selby was a complete scoundrel from the beginning. You might as well know that his trade in black ivory was just another term for slave trading. His blindness had nothing to do with driving him to crime, nor did your mother's actions. He was a rogue before. His blindness only allowed him to play a more strategic game, which was likely to appeal to his nature. However, discussing him won't change anything. I have purchased a ranch next to Fly Bend and hired Joe as the foreman. I have also signed contracts to rebuild the house, and I have placed orders for furnishings from the east. I plan to buy my livestock at the autumn roundup. All I need now is for you to tell me when you will marry me, sweetheart. But Jack, you don't seem to understand. I can't marry you. Father was a murderer. I don't care what he was, Danny. It doesn't matter to me. I am not marrying your father. Heather was upset. The casual way he treated the subject bothered her, but she was completely serious. But Jack, think of the shame. Your family, everyone around here. Now let's not be foolish, Danny, Milligan said, walking over to the girl's side and taking hold of her forcefully. Despite her protests, his arm slipped around her waist, and he pulled her close, kissing her gently. My family is not marrying you, and the people around here who, by the way, can't and don't want to judge won't be throwing stones either. Now, you saved my life twice, once with your caring nursing and once with your bravery, and I'm telling you, no one has the right to save a life and then do everything in their power to make that life miserable for the person they've taken care of. That would be a terrible and unkind action, and it goes against your kind heart. Sweetheart, he continued, kissing her again, you must finish the good work. I'm still not well. In fact, I'm so weak that any shock could make me relapse. In summary, as far as I can tell, the only thing that can save me from a terrible death caused by illness or disease is marriage. I know you must be extremely bored, but please don't interrupt. You need to know the harsh reality. I am constantly sick, but if you don't marry me, I'll have Joe bury me at the intersection. Look at all the money I've spent to create our home. Think about it, Danny. Our home. And old Joe will assist us. Oh, stop, or you'll make me. Marry me. That's exactly what I intend, darling. Now, seriously, let's forget the past. Lonnie, your father, Anton, all of them except Arizona. Heather snuggled closer to him despite her objections. There was something so powerful, dependable, and authoritative about her Jack that made him irresistible to her. She knew she was wrong to think like this at such a moment, but after all, she was a weak, affectionate woman fighting for what she believed was right. If she found that her heart, which had long been deprived of love, overcame her sense of duty, should she be blamed? Milligan felt her gentle embrace and immediately urged her for an answer. Time is running out, my dearest. Look through that window. Files and Joe are coming over to you. Is it Mary, or am I supposed to go fishing for polar bears in the Arctic without a coat? I don't care which. I mean, no. Yes, quickly. They're on the porch. The girl nodded. Yes, she whispered so softly that his face touched hers as he strained to hear, and it remained there until the burly sheriff knocked on the door. He entered, followed by Joe. Milligan and Heather stood side by side, still holding hands. Hey, Files, Milligan said enthusiastically, addressing both men. Let me introduce you to my future wife, Mrs. Thomas Milligan. Joe, he added, turning to the nervous little man who was fidgeting with his hat. Are the animal enclosures ready? And do you have my branding tools prepared? You see, I've successfully captured her. The little man grinned even wider, almost stretching his mouth to his ear. Heather listened to the outrageous remark without concern and simply responded in a typical wife-like manner. Don't be ridiculous, Jack. Files smiled appreciatively at her comment. Then he cleared his throat to bring their attention back and took out an official envelope from his jacket pocket. I just brought you the verdict regarding your property, Miss Selby, he said deliberately. Should I read it to you, or do you prefer? Never mind the reading, Heather interrupted impulsively. Just tell me what it says. Well, I must admit it's better this way. The legal jargon can be confusing, the officer emphasized. You can read it later. I don't think the government could have treated you any better than they have. The property, he deliberately avoided mentioning the rancher's name, will remain yours, with one condition. There will be an investigation into all claims of property loss in the district over the past 10 years. Any approved claims will have to be settled from the estate. Claimants have 5 years to submit their claims. After that, everything reverts to you. Heather turned to her lover as soon as the officer finished speaking. And Jack, when that time comes, we'll sell everything and donate the money to charity, and just live in our own little home. Deal, exclaimed Milligan, and lifting her up, he passionately kissed her. The incident made the sheriff cough loudly, while Joe angrily threw his hat to the ground and exclaimed in a voice filled with intense excitement, "Wow! I really want to scream!" Chapter 24. When winter arrives in Canada, it completely shuts down without a doubt. The snow settles and stays. The sun shines, but lacks warmth. The still air cuts through any clothing except for fur, boots, or insulated shoes. The farmers stay indoors, only attending to their daily tasks known as doing the chores, once winter takes hold of the land. There is minimal traffic on the snow-covered trails now, a horse rider on a social visit, a sled loaded with firewood for the wood-burning stoves at home, a sleigh pulled by a lively team of young horses, as a rancher and their spouse venture to a distant city for household shopping, and even an occasional low-built, red-painted sleigh known as a jumper, resembling a packing crate with shafts attached. But these are the only sights. Work has practically ceased in the farming areas, and a period of hibernation has begun, where ranchers and farmers alike rest during their slow time after the demanding tasks of the warmer months. Even the brightest sunlight cannot uplift the gloomy outlook to a significant extent. Out on the Edmonton Trail, hundreds of miles north of Falls, at the crossroads where the Batoul Trail branches eastward, the desolate vista is intensified by the skeletal branches of a snow-covered bluff. The shelter of trees no longer provides refuge from the wind, which now howls through the bare branches and forces any unfortunate creature seeking protection against the winter storm to flee. However, during winter, the crossroads are usually deserted. Contrary to usual practice, it is evident that a horse rider has recently visited the bluff. For there are hoofprints on one of the intersecting paths, on the path that comes from somewhere in the south. The marks are sharp imprints and look fresh, but they end at the intersection. Here they have turned off into the wilderness and cannot be seen anymore. The situation is somewhat puzzling, but there is something even more perplexing about the desolate place. Just beyond where the hoofprints veer off, a lightning-struck pine tree stands alone, bare and charred from the fiery experience it went through. And perched in the fork of one of its withered branches, about the height of a horseman's head, is a sign, a black sign, as black as the tree trunk that supports it. As we approach to investigate the purpose of such a peculiar phenomenon on a prairie trail, we discover that someone has written a message for those who may arrive at the intersection. A message of strange significance and obscurity. The characters are carefully written in chalk and have been emphasized with repeated markings and an attempt at block capitals. Additionally, there is a roughly sketched hand on the sign, with an extended finger pointing vaguely in the direction of the trail that leads to Batoul. This is the one-way trail. We read this and look at the pointing finger, which is so distinct in its outline, and our initial inclination is to chuckle. But somehow, before the laughter fully matures, it fades away, leaving behind a look of astonishment mixed with reverence. For there is something sinister in the message which, though we do not comprehend it, still has the ability to stir us. If we are prairie dwellers, we will not have any inclination to laugh at all. Instead, we will furrow our brows and cautiously move away from the ominous black sign. It is highly likely that we will avoid the indicated trail and choose to take a detour if our destination happens to be Batoul. Why is that sign there? Who has set it up? And the one-way trail is the trail over which there is no returning. The message is no joke. The coldly shining sun has set, and finally a horse and rider enter the bluff. They turn off into the woods and are seen no more. The long night passes. Dawn arrives again, and as the daylight widens, the horseman reappears and rides off down the trail. In the evening, he returns again, disappears into the woods again, and with daylight, rides off again. Day after day, this curious coming and going continues without any apparent purpose, unless it is that the man has no place but the skeleton woods in which to rest. And with each coming and going, the man rides slower, he lounges wearily in his saddle, and before the end of a week, he looks like a mere shadow of the man who first rode into the bluff. Starvation is evident in his emaciated features, the bright, feverish eyes. His horse, too, looks little better. Eventually, one evening, he enters the woods, and the following dawn does not witness his departure. All that day, there is the faint sound of a horse moving around among the trees with a limping gait that indicates the use of a knee halter. But the man makes no sound. As night falls, a solitary figure can be seen sitting on a horse at a point that is hidden from the trail by a screen of bushes. The man sits still, silent, but drooping. His tall, gaunt frame is bent almost double over the horn of his saddle due to his weakness. The horse's head hangs heavily with sleep, but the man's large, wild eyes are wide open and shining with burning eagerness. The horse sleeps and often has to be awakened by its rider as it stumbles under its burden. But the man is as awake as a night owl searching for its prey, and the determined set of his wasted face implies a purpose no less ruthless. At sunrise, the situation remains unchanged. The man still slumps over his saddle, slightly lower perhaps, but his overall posture remains the same. As the sunlight pierces through the horizon and illuminates the darkness of the wilderness into a gray twilight, the horse raises its head and pricks up its ears. The man's eyes quickly glance towards the south, and his alertness intensifies. Now, the soft sound of swirling snow becomes audible, and the muted sound of a horse's hooves can be heard on the trail. The expression that appears in the man's eyes clearly indicates that this is what he has been patiently waiting for, that finally the solution to his solitary watch has arrived. He guides his horse further back into the foliage, and his hand swiftly moves to one of the holsters on his hips. His thin, tense features are firmly set, and his sunken eyes radiate a profound, determined light. Daylight gradually expands and reveals the desolate surroundings. The sound grows closer. The silent horseman firmly grasps his firearm and places it across his lap, with his index finger poised on the trigger. His sharp ears inform him that the traveler has entered the wilderness and is guiding his horse by foot. The time feels interminable as the horseman waits, but his patience is far from depleted. For over a week, surviving on the most meager provisions, which his empty wallet has compelled him to beg for in that desolate region, he has anticipated this encounter. Now, through the foliage, he spots the traveler as his horse leisurely ambles down the trail towards him. It is a slight figure clad in fur, much like his own, but judging by the satisfied smirk that crosses his gaunt features, it is evident that this meeting brings the waiting man great contentment. He notices the stranger's alert movements, the quick flashing black eyes, and the dark features as he peers from side to side in the bushes, over the edge of the turned-down storm collar. He also takes note of the legs positioned close to the saddle and the clumsily gloved hands. He also observes the uneasy glances the stranger casts around him, despite the solitude, revealing the man's fear of his surroundings. The stranger moves alongside the black signboard. His sidelong glances cannot overlook the irregular, chalked characters. His horse comes to a complete stop in front of them, and the rider's eyes become fixed on the peculiar message. He reads it, and as he does, his lips move as if he is spelling out the words he sees. "This is the one-way trail," he reads. Then, his eyes turn towards the direction indicated by the pointing finger. He looks down the trail that leads to Batul, and a strange expression crosses his dark features. He instinctively understands that the warning is intended for him. In his heart, he believes that his own death lies somewhere out there. Yet he does not turn and run away. He simply sits, looking and thinking. Once again, his eyes are drawn back to the inscription on the board, and he reads and rereads the message it conveys. Throughout, he is plagued by a curious, uncertain feeling. His mind recalls many scenes that reflect poorly on him, even though he possesses a callous nature. There is something strangely prophetic in that message, and he cannot shake off its effect. While he stares, his dark features undergo a change in color, and he brushes one gloved hand across his forehead. There is a sudden crackling of breaking branches just a few yards away from him. His horse jumps to the side, and he struggles to maintain his position in the saddle. Then he quickly looks in the direction where the noise is coming from, only to recoil as if trying to defend himself from a punch. He is staring into the barrel of a heavy revolver, with Arizona's intense eyes fixed on him. The silence of the woods remains unbroken as the two men lock eyes. The gun doesn't shoot its deadly bullet. It is simply there, aimed to assert its owner's authority. Its commanding presence is not easily challenged in a land where, back in those days, the strongest law was carried in a holster on the hip. The man composes himself and surrenders. His hands, covered in gloves, put him at a significant disadvantage. Arizona notices this and lowers his gun, but he never takes his eyes off the gloved hands before him. He straightens up in the saddle, refusing to show any weakness to this man. "I reckon I've been waiting for you, tough McCulloch, for almost a week," he says slowly, in a thin, harsh voice. "I've been tracking you too, I suppose. You were hidden pretty well, but not well enough. I managed to find you, and I wasn't going to lose sight of you. When you left Fly Bend like the beaten dog you were, I was right behind you, and I haven't left your trail ever since. You see, in all the hundreds of miles you've traveled since leaving the creek, I have witnessed every move you've made. I've followed you, led you, been beside you, and discovered where you were heading, and I've caught up and waited for you. There's a score to be settled between you and me. I'm right here to settle that score." Arizona's solemn face remained unchanged as he spoke. There was no anger in his tone, just a cold, composed determination, and some disdain. And whatever emotions the mixed-race individual may have had, he appeared incapable of displaying them, except for the pale color of his face. The intrigue of the message on the sign still seemed to captivate him because, disregarding the other person's words, he glanced over at the burned tree trunk and nodded at it. "See? That thing. It's your doing, right?" "Yes, and I assume the meaning is clear to you. You've stumbled upon the path we all find ourselves on at some point, partner, and that path is commonly known as the one-way trail. It's a smooth, wide path, and one that is as easy to traverse as you're likely to find anywhere. It's so effortless that you can't help but continue on it, and you only grasp its treachery when you entertain the thought of turning back. I reckon one of those glacier formations atop those mountains over yonder is probably easier to climb than going against that trail. The foundation of that trail is blood that's mainly shed in acts of crime, and its surface is sprinkled with all sorts of wrongdoing that you and I have engaged in. Say, it's not a lengthy trail, I reckon. It's rather short, in fact, and the end comes abruptly and violently. But I reckon the end isn't always the same. Sometimes you'll find a rope hanging in the air. Sometimes there's a knife lurking about. Sometimes there's a gun with a light trigger waiting conveniently, just like mine. But I reckon all those things mean essentially the same. It's death, partner, and it's not easy either. Say, you and I are pretty close to that end. You especially. I reckon you're going to pass over first. Maybe I'll pass over when I'm ready. It's not just necessary for us to talk about the gospel with one another, but I'm going to tell you something that maybe you're worrying about just about now. It's about a guy's girl, his wife, who that guy never did you any harm. But first, you'll put up those hands of yours. I see that they're getting uneasy, worrying around as though they have a notion to get a grip on something. The half-breed made no attempt to obey, but stared coldly into the thin face before him. "Hands up!" roared Arizona, with such a dreadful change of tone that the man's hands were thrust above his head as though a shot had struck him. Arizona moved over to him and removed a heavy pistol from the man's jacket pocket, and then, having satisfied himself that he had no other weapons concealed about him, dropped back to his original position. "Oh, I was just saying about that guy's wife," he went on calmly. "Say, you acted like a coward toward that guy, and that guy was me. I don't say I was just a great husband for that girl, but that wasn't your concern. What's troubling is your meddling, waiting until he's out of the way and then running off with the woman and all. I guess I'm going to kill you for that for sure. But there's none of the coward in me. I'm going to treat you as you wouldn't treat me if I was sitting where you are, which I'm not. You're going to hit the one-way trail, but you can hit it like what you aren't, and that's a man." Arizona's calm, judicial tone provoked his listener, But tough McCulloch was not the man to shout. His was a more deadly composition that the open American hated and despised, and hardly understood. He contented himself with a cynical remark that fired the other's explosive temper so that he could barely hold his hand. "I was good to her," he said with a shrug. "You were good to her, were you? You, who knew her man was alive. You, who maybe have half a dozen wives alive. You were good to her. Well, you're going to pay now. Understand? You're going to pay for your involvement with Chips. Chips that are soaked in blood. Your blood." The mixed-race individual shrugged once more. He appeared unconcerned outwardly, but inwardly he cursed his luck for wearing gloves when he entered the bluff. He observed Arizona as he dismounted his horse. He noticed the signs of weakness that the other man could no longer hide, but they meant nothing to him, or at least nothing that could benefit him. He knew he had to wait for the cowboy's decision, and why. The ring of silver metal that marks the muzzle of a gun has the ability to hold both brave men and cowards. He dared not move, and he was wise enough not to attempt it. Arizona rode his horse into the bushes and approached his captive, who remained on his horse, stopping alongside the man's stirrup a few yards to the side. Arizona's features now displayed the shadow of a grim smile as he paused and looked into the face that showed such feigned indifference. "See this gun," he said, drawing attention to the one he held in his right hand. "It's a .45, and I'm guessing it's loaded in 2 chambers. Then he cleared the snow off a small patch of the road with his foot. "I placed this gun right here," he continued, stooping to place it down, but still keeping his eyes fixed on the horseman. "Then I step back like this, moving backward with long, regular strides. And I reckon I count 15 paces. Then I clear another space," he added grimly, like some sinister magician describing the process of his tricks, "and stand ready. Now, Tough McCulloch, or Anton, or whatever you prefer to be called, low life as you are, you're going to die honorably. You're going to die in a gentlemanly square duel. You're going to die in a splendid manner that is too good for you, but don't make any mistake. You're going to die. Yes, you're going to leave that platform of yours and stand on that spot, and I'm going to count 3, nice and steady, 1, 2, 3, just like that. And then we're going to pick up those guns and start shooting. I suppose you'll fall first because I'm definitely going to kill you. Say, you'll do me a favor by getting off that platform." The half-breed made no move. His indifference was leaving him under the deliberate intention of this man. "Get off of that platform!" Arizona shouted his command with all the force of his suppressed anger. The man instantly obeyed, and it was now clear that his bravery was deserting him. But as his courage waned, his cunning increased. He made a feeble attempt at swagger as he walked up to his position, and his fierce eyes closely watched every move of his opponent. And Arizona's obvious state of hunger struck him strongly, and the realization of it suggested to his scheming mind a possible means of escape. "You're very generous giving me chances, sir," he said through clenched teeth. "Maybe you'll change your tune later." "Bah! You make me laugh. Well, I'm ready." "Yes, go ahead and laugh," Arizona replied calmly. "And in the meantime, while you're laughing, I'll trouble you to take off that sheepskin. It's not suitable clothing for you in any way. However, it helps to toughen your skin. Take it off." The half-breed obeyed, and the 2 men now stood still. Arizona was an impressive figure in that snowy world. Never before had his presence been so noticeable. It may have been the purpose that drove him that elevated him to something greater than the lean, explosive cowboy he had previously been. His old slouching walk, despite his obvious weakness, had completely disappeared. His unkempt head was held high, and he stared at his adversary with eyes that the other couldn't meet. For the moment, at least, the unmistakable mark of his disastrous life was hidden by the intensity in his eyes and the determination on his face. And this moral strength was evident in every action, in a way that no amount of force or words could achieve. This man in front of him had stolen the woman he loved. He deserved to die. His gun was still in his hand. "When I say 3, you just reach for your gun and shoot," he said seriously. He fell silent, and after a brief pause, slowly bent down to place his weapon on the ground. His vigilant eyes never wavered as he continued to watch the man before him. He bent lower, and the gun touched the ground. He straightened up quickly and stood ready. 1. the half-breed flinched, as if a sudden spasm of pain had racked his body. Then he stood poised, as if about to pounce. "Two!" McCulloch moved again. He bent down with astonishing speed, seized his gun, and the next moment 2 loud shots echoed as he tossed his smoking weapon to the ground. Arizona hadn't moved, although his face had paled slightly. He knew he had been wounded. "3!" The American bent down and grabbed his gun just as the other made a dash for his horse. He stood up and took careful aim. The half-breed was in the process of mounting his horse. A shot rang out, and the would-be fugitive's foot slipped out of the stirrup, causing his knees to buckle. Another shot pierced the air, and without a sound, the man crumpled to the ground, a thick red stream pouring from a wound on his left temple. Then silence returned once more. After a while, the sound of a slow, slouching walk disturbed the somber calm of the desolate cliff. Arizona walked slowly off the road. He reached the edge of the shrubbery, but he didn't go any further, because he staggered, and his hands gripped his body around his chest. His eyes were half closed, and his face appeared ghastly in the wintry light. With a great effort, he regained his balance and suddenly sat down in the snow. He was just off the path, with his back against a bush. Leaning forward, he brought his knees up and wrapped his arms around them, rocking himself gently back and forth. And as he sat there, he felt something damp and warm soaking through his clothing around his chest. Several times he nodded, moving his lips, and his eyelids drooped lower and lower until he couldn't see anything around him. He knew it was the end for him, and he was content. He remained in this position for a while. Once he opened his eyes and glanced around, but he didn't derive any satisfaction from what he saw. The world around him seemed unsteady and strangely dark. The snow was no longer white, but had turned gray, growing darker with each passing moment. Gratefully, he closed his eyes again and continued to cradle himself. Now his limbs started to grow cold and feel numb. It was difficult for him to keep his hands securely clasped around his knees, but he felt at ease, even comfortable. There was something comforting in that warm sensation he felt emanating from somewhere around his chest. The minutes slipped away, and the man's lips continued to move silently. Was he praying for the soul that he knew was departing from his body? It could have been. Perhaps he was praying for a woman and a man whom he had grown to love in the old days of Fly Bend, and whom he was leaving behind. This latter was probably more likely, as he was not a selfish person. Once again his eyes opened, and now they were completely unseeing, but his mind remained clear, for he spoke words that were understandable, slowly escaping his pale lips. "It's over, I suppose," he muttered. "Maybe life isn't without wealth for some. I guess I just never found success. Well, I'm prepared for the reckoning." His hands released their grip and his legs straightened. Like a tired individual seeking rest, he rolled over and laid with his face buried in the snow, and he did not move again, because Arizona had put an end to his journey on the one-way trail. The end. This concludes Hearts on Trail, a Western romance novel. Written by Letha Watson. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.